It is the summer of 1916, and the Western Front is a place of almost incomprehensible violence. Somewhere near the shattered town of Pozières, in the moonscape of the Somme, a young British infantryman flattens himself against the wall of a captured German trench. He is perhaps 19 years old. His lungs burn with the particular stench of that summer. Cordite, mud, and something else he has chosen not to name. 20 feet ahead of him, around a sharp bend in the zigzagging trench line, he can hear German voices, low, urgent, getting louder. His rifle is useless at this range, in this confined space. His bayonet has already been broken, but in his right hand, cold and reassuringly solid, he holds something that might just save his life. He pulls a pin with his left hand, releases the lever, counts 1, 2, and hurls the object around the corner. There is a pause of perhaps 3 seconds, enough time for his heart to beat twice, and then this world behind him erupts. When the smoke clears and the screaming stops, the trench is his. The object that achieved this feat weighed just under 800 grams, 28 ounces. It was roughly the size of a large lemon, and it had been designed less than 2 years earlier by a civilian engineer in Birmingham who had never fired a shot in anger. This is the story of the Mills bomb, officially designated the number 5. Grenade later evolved into the number 36M, and why German soldiers, who had entered the war with what they believed was a decisive advantage in grenade technology, came to dread it above almost every other weapon in the British arsenal. It is a story of industrial ingenuity, of a problem so pressing it demanded a solution within months, and of a design so effective that it remained in active service with British forces for over 60 years. To understand why the Mills bomb mattered so profoundly, you must first understand the crisis that preceded it when Britain entered the First World War. In August 1914, the British Army possessed almost no hand grenades at all. This was not mere oversight, it reflected a genuine, doctrinal assumption that the coming war would be a war of movement, of cavalry charges and rapid infantry advances were the close quarters. Nastiness of trench warfare simply would not feature. Grenades, after all, were the weapons of sieges, of static fighting, and nobody in. Whitehall believed this war would be static. They were, of course, catastrophically wrong. By Christmas 1914, both sides had dug themselves into a line of trenches that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border, roughly 700 kilometers of earthworks that would barely move for the next 4 years. Suddenly, the grenade was not a relic of siege warfare. It was the essential weapon of a conflict fought in narrow, winding corridors of earth, where the distance between two opposing forces might be measured not in miles, but in yards. Germany had prepared for exactly this kind of fighting. By early 1915, German troops were equipped with the steel hand granite, the stick, grenade, or potato masher, as British soldiers would come to call it, a weapon that used a long wooden handle to extend the throwing arc and deliver an explosive charge weighing around 170 grams, 6 ounces, to targets at considerable distance. It was not a sophisticated device, but it worked. German grenadiers could outrange their British counterparts. Consistently, and in the confined geometry of the trenches, range was everything. What did the British have in response? Initially, almost nothing that deserved the name. In the desperate improvisation of 1914 and early 1915, British soldiers were throwing homemade bombs fashioned from jam. Tins filled with explosive and nails lit with a length of slow-burning fuse. These jam tin grenades were unreliable, inconsistent in their timing, and deeply dangerous to the person throwing them. The fuse. Length determined the delay, except when it did not, which was rather. More often than anyone would have liked. Men were wounded and killed by their own devices before they ever left the British trench. The War Office recognized the emergency. By early 1915, a number of the designs were being rushed into production or field trials, including the No. 1 grenade, a cumbersome device with a striker that had to be armed before throwing, and the No. 2, which used a percussion fuse that detonated on impact, and therefore also, with terrible regularity, on the edge of the trench as the thrower released it. The British Army needed something reliable, something that would not kill the person throwing it, something that a frightened, exhausted, poorly trained conscript could use effectively under fire in the dark with shaking hands. The man who provided it was William Mills, a 56-year-old hand grenade manufacturer from Sunderland who had previously spent his career designing golf clubs and improving sandcasting techniques. He was neither a soldier nor a munitions specialist in the conventional sense. He was an engineer, practical, methodical, obsessed with the problems of mechanism and manufacture. In January 1915, working out of his factory in Birmingham, the Mills Munition Factory on Brearley Street, he began work on what would become the most successful hand grenade in British military history. The design Mills arrived at was, in retrospect, a masterpiece of applied engineering. The body of the grenade was cast iron, molded into a distinctive segmented pattern, a grid of raised squares that covered the entire exterior of the oval body. This pattern was not, as many have assumed, intended to produce fragments when the grenade exploded. The segmentation actually served two primary functions. It provided grip for the thrower's hand, particularly essential when fingers were wet, cold, or shaking from exhaustion, and it allowed the internal explosion to fracture the iron body along predictable lines, producing fragments of broadly consistent size and velocity. The result was a grenade that threw its lethal debris with far greater uniformity than a smooth-bodied device. The fusing system was the true innovation. At the base of the grenade sat a central tube, the striker housing, into which a spring-loaded striker was fitted. This striker was held in the cocked position by a safety lever, a flat metal arm that ran along the side of the body and was held against it by a split-pin safety. To use the grenade, the thrower gripped it firmly in the throwing hand, ensuring the lever was pressed hard against the body. With the free hand, the pin was withdrawn. At this point, the grenade was live, but as long as the thrower maintained their grip on the lever, nothing happened. Only when the grenade left the hand and the lever flew free did the striker. Mechanism release, igniting a delay fuse that ran in the original number 5, designed for between 4 and 5 seconds. This system, the fly-off lever as it became known, solved the central problem of every previous British grenade design. It meant there was no arming sequence to forget under fire. It meant there was no burning fuse visible to the enemy which could allow a grenade to be thrown back. It meant the delay was consistent, mechanical, and independent of any action the thrower had to take after releasing the device. A soldier could hold a primed Mills bomb for as long as his nerve held, counting down the seconds, waiting until the last safe moment before releasing it directly into a position. At a stroke, the British had not merely Caught up with German grenade technology, they had surpassed it. The dimensions were carefully considered. The number 5 grenade measured approximately 95 millimeters, 3.75 inches in length, with a maximum diameter of 61 millimeters, 2.4 inches, roughly the size of a cricket ball, which was not accidental, since virtually every British male who might be expected to throw it had spent years perfecting a throwing action with a similarly proportioned object, the weight of approximately 765 grams, 27 ounces, was calculated to be light enough for repeated throwing, but heavy enough to carry sufficient explosive filling, typically around 70 grams, 2.5 ounces of baritol or TNT. The manufacturing process established at the Birmingham factory was a model of wartime industrial efficiency. The cast iron bodies were produced using sand casting techniques that mills had spent decades refining. The fuse assemblies were manufactured separately and inserted during final assembly, allowing different components to be produced at different facilities. By mid-1915, production had reached tens of thousands of grenades per week. By 1916, following the explosion of demand triggered by the Somme offensive, output had grown to hundreds of thousands per week across multiple licensed manufacturers. Estimates suggest that by the war's end in November 1918, somewhere between 70 and 75 million Mills bombs had been produced, though exact figures remain difficult to verify given the pace and complexity of wartime production. Records. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it means you will not miss what is coming next. The operational deployment of the Mills bomb transformed the character of trench warfare on the Western Front almost immediately after its introduction in May 1915, within weeks of the number 5 reaching front line. Reports were coming back to the War Office describing a fundamental shift in the dynamics of trench raiding. The small-scale, nocturnal attacks on enemy positions that constituted much of the daily violence of the Western Front. A typical trench raid of the mid-war period was a small unit operation, conducted in darkness, often by parties of between 10 and 30 men. The objective was to penetrate the enemy's forward trench system, cause casualties and disruption, take prisoners for intelligence purposes, and withdraw before the enemy could organize a response. The Mills bomb made such operations dramatically more effective. Raiding parties were typically equipped with between 6 and 12 grenades per man, a staggering expenditure of ordnance by the standards of earlier warfare, but one that the new industrial production rates could sustain. Accounts from German units facing British raids in 1915 and 1916 describe with considerable consistency the psychological shock of encountering the Mills bomb for the first time, unlike the stick grenade, which tumbled visibly through the air and gave defenders a brief, agonizing window in which to react. The Mills bomb was compact and flew in a flat trajectory, harder to see in low light, harder to anticipate. The distinctive segmented body, once recognized, became associated in German military minds with immediate danger. A captured German infantry manual from late 1916 devoted considerable space to advice on how to minimize casualties from British grenade attacks. Evidence, if any were needed, that the weapon had made a decisive psychological impression. The Gallipoli campaign of 1915 provided another theater in which the Mills bomb demonstrated its effectiveness. Fighting in the confined gullies and ravines of the peninsula placed an enormous premium on close-range weapons, and the grenade became the dominant tool of the attritional fighting that characterized the campaign. Records from Anzac. Units describe grenade battles, sustained exchanges of thrown munitions across distances of 10 to 20 meters that lasted for hours, with casualties on both sides determined almost entirely by skill in throwing and taking cover. The comparison with Germany's primary grenade, the steel hand granate, reveals the different philosophies embedded in each design. The stick. Grenade's great advantage was range. The long handle functioned as a throwing lever, allowing an average soldier to achieve distances of 40 to 60 meters, 130 to 195 feet, with reasonable accuracy. Its disadvantage was the nature of its explosion, because the steel hand granate used a relatively thin metal canister as its body. It produced fewer consistent fragments than the Mills bomb. German grenade. Designers had prioritized blast over fragmentation, useful for clearing. Open ground or destroying field fortifications, less effective for producing casualties in the confined geometry of a trench system. The Mills bomb made a different trade. Its effective throwing range was shorter, typically 30 to 40 meters, 100 to 130 feet, for the average thrower, though exceptional soldiers could achieve 50 meters or more, but its fragmentation pattern was both denser and more consistent. At the grenade's burst radius of roughly 10 to 15 meters, 33 to 50 feet, the probability of a fragment strike was considerably higher than with the German equivalent for the specific conditions of the Western Front, where the target was almost always another human being in a narrow trench system. This made the Mills bomb the more lethal weapon at the engagement distances that actually mattered. The Americans, when they entered the war in 1917, were sufficiently impressed by the Mills design that they based their own Mark II grenade, the weapon that would become the dominant American grenade of both world wars, substantially on the Mills pattern. The segmented body, the fly-off lever, the central striker mechanism, all were present in the American design, adapted to American manufacturing standards and slightly modified in dimensions, but unmistakably derived from the Birmingham original. The Mark II remained in U.S. service until the 1960s, a remarkable longevity for a weapon design that had its roots in 1915. Australia, Canada, and New Zealand adopted the Mills bomb as a standard weapon for their imperial forces. The design was licensed to manufacturers in multiple countries, and variants were produced across the Commonwealth throughout both world wars. The number 36M variant A, modified version, designed to be adapted for use with a rifle discharger, which could project it to ranges of up to 150 meters, 490 feet, remained in British service until the early 1970s, meaning the fundamental design that William Mills arrived at in a Birmingham factory. In early 1915 was in active military use for more than half a century. Assessing the historical impact of the Mills bomb requires some care about the distinction between material effect and psychological effect. In purely statistical terms, the contribution of any single weapon type to overall casualties in the First World War is genuinely difficult to disaggregate from the broader lethal environment of that conflict. Artillery caused the majority of casualties on the Western Front. Estimates suggest somewhere between 58 and 65% of total wounds, while small arms, fire, gas, and other weapons accounted for the remainder. Grenades were responsible for a significant, but not dominant, proportion of casualties in the trench fighting of 1915 to 1918. But this framing misses what the Mills bomb actually achieved. Its Significance was not simply in the casualties it caused, but in what it made possible. It gave the British infantry a reliable, standardized, close-range weapon at the moment when the nature of the war demanded exactly that. It ended the period of desperate improvisation, the jam-tin bombs, the unreliable percussion fuses, the burning fuses that could not be trusted, and replaced it with a weapon that a soldier could trust absolutely. That trust is not a trivial thing. In the particular hell of a trench raid conducted in darkness against an enemy, at close quarters, confidence in your weapon is not a secondary consideration. It is everything. The psychological impact on German forces was also far from negligible. Captured German soldiers consistently mentioned British grenade attacks as among the most feared aspects of combat on the Western Front. The sound of the Mills bomb, the flat, authoritative crack of its fragmentation explosion, distinct from the deeper thump of artillery, became associated in German military experience with the specific terror of the British trench raid. Several German regimental histories from the war period use language about British grenade attacks. That one simply does not find in descriptions of small arms fire, and this tells its own story about the weapon's psychological weight. Surviving examples of the Mills bomb can be found in military museums across the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. The Imperial War Museum in London holds several specimens, including early production number 5 grenades and later number 36M variants. The Royal Armouries in Leeds displays examples alongside the German weapons it complemented and competed with. Deactivated specimens regularly appear at militaria, auctions and in private collections, and the segmented body, so distinctive, so immediately recognizable, remains one of the most iconically British objects of the 20th century. Return, now, to that trench on the Somme in the summer of 1916. The young soldier has pressed himself against the earthen wall. He can hear the voices around the corner getting louder. He is cold in the way that only the particular damp of chalk and clay can make a person cold. He has not slept in 36 hours. His hands are not entirely steady, but the object in his right hand is steady. It will do exactly what it is designed to do. The lever, pressed against the segmented body, will fly free the moment he releases it. The striker will fire. The delay will run 4 seconds, 5 at most. The fragments will travel outward at roughly 400 meters per second, each one carrying enough kinetic energy to wound or kill at the distances involved. None of this requires the young soldier to do anything except throw it and take cover. William Mills and his engineers in Birmingham have taken care of the rest. 75 million of these objects were produced. 75 million times. The lever flew free, the striker fell, and the 4-second clock began. In the ruins of French villages and the ravines of Gallipoli, in the Libyan desert and the jungles of Burma, in the hedgerows of Normandy and the frozen hills of Korea, the flat crack of the Mills bomb fragmentation burst marked the close of another small, violent chapter in the long catalogue of human conflict. The Germans called it, with reluctant admiration, the English egg. The British soldiers who carried it called it, with the particular affection that fighting men develop for the tools that keep them alive. Simply the Mills. It was a grenade. It was, by most meaningful measures, the finest grenade of the First World War. And it began with a civilian engineer in Birmingham who looked at a problem, understood what was needed, and built a solution that outlasted him, outlasted the war it was built for, and outlasted every weapon the enemy brought against it.